Everyone, my name is Molly Donnellan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the International Studies Major Advisor here at UW-Madison, and I work closely with the IRIS NRC, the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center. They are today's sponsor. The IRIS NRC, as many of you may know, supports and enhances global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. IRIS NRC provides resources and expertise to K-12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. Just by way of brief introductions, Essie Lenchner, who you may see up in the bar of Zoom characters, is going to be helping us with tech support behind the scenes. So if you have any challenges today, please use the chat function to contact her directly or reach out by email. We will be recording today's event and sharing the link and additional digital resources in a post-event email, but you will only show on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. Regarding the Q&A, if you have questions that come up as Jacob is presenting today, you can post them in the chat, but we'll also have kind of a separate time at the end specifically for questions and answers where you can post that in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you to interact in person, virtually in person if you'd like. So before we begin today, we want to start the event by sharing the UW-Madison Land Acknowledgement Statement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Teejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. So in addition to kind of a spoken land acknowledgement, which is easily said, we also wanted to invite you to explore some further resources on the Our Shared Future website, which I'll put the link to in the chat, specifically calling to your attention some of the resources available on the Wisconsin First Nations website that targets teaching resources for K-12 educators who want to incorporate teaching about Indigenous peoples and Wisconsin First Nations in their curriculum. So please do feel free to explore those resources as well. We are very excited to be welcoming this evening UW-Madison alum and international journalist Jacob Kushner. Jacob is an international correspondent who writes magazine and other long-form stories from Africa, Germany, and the Caribbean. He reports on migration and statelessness, science and global health, history and foreign aid, terrorism and violent extremism, climate change, and wildlife. His writing has appeared in dozens of publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Economist, National Geographic, and many more. He has photographed for National Geographic and field produced for Vice on HBO and PBS NewsHour, and he is the author of China's Congo Plan, as well as today's featured book, This Is How the Heart Beats, LGBTQ East Africa, in collaboration with another UW alum, photographer Jake Naughton. Please join me in a warm virtual welcome for tonight's guest, Jacob Kushner.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Please let me know if at any point you have trouble hearing me. I'm excited to speak about this book and this project that I had the chance to work on over the course of a few years. I'll briefly just introduce myself to how I got into this project, and we can talk a little bit about the book, which I think some of you will be receiving, and then also some of the other articles related to LGBTQ rights in East Africa, where I'm based normally as a journalist, although today I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, meeting with students this week and doing other events here on the campus. So yes, I think one of the key takeaways I hope that we come away with, if not from this talk, which is going to be more focused on this book, is that I think it's I hope that, and I've met some of you actually who are here in this chat, educators who are speaking about refugees in their classrooms and resettlement and what the United States does and doesn't. And basically what I hope to do today is to use the example of LGBTQ refugees in Africa to understand a little bit about refugees around the world, refugee resettlement system, and help students get and hope us all get an idea, and perhaps our students get an idea of how the U.S. fits in to the global resettlement system, and the sense that, you know, how accurate it is that the United States remains a nation of immigrants. And with that, I think I'd like to start with just kind of pointing out, on the Statue of Liberty, the new Colossus, which we hear quoted so often, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore by Emma Lazarus. I would say that my experience covering refugees and stateless people from Haiti to Kenya and beyond is that the United States doesn't do that anymore. And to be honest, from what I hear and what I've read by authors who have written about this, almost never in U.S. history has the U.S. Opened its doors to those sorts of people. In fact, beginning with the kind of most notably the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, certainly marked one point and one major part of U.S. history when we stopped letting in immigrants from certain places with the travel ban. And then, of course, more recently, we've had travel bans, we've had immigrant children locked in cages, we've had so much. And I think the reaction to some journalists and historians I know to the more recent kind of actions that the United States has taken toward refugees, I think it's shock, but I don't think it's surprise, because people who have studied the history tend to find that we've actually been doing many of these things for decades or sometimes centuries. And so I wanted to start off with a little bit about refugees. What is a refugee? The Universal Declaration and also the 19th Convention specifically defines refugees as people who have fled war, violence, conflict, or persecution and have crossed an international border to find safety in another country. So I think it's really important when we talk about refugees to differentiate that from a term we often hear, which is immigrants or migrants. So migrants is actually a term that many journalists we're hopefully trying not to use anymore because it's so vague. And immigrants can also be kind of a vague term, but encompasses a much bigger group and may be relevant. But when we're talking about here are refugees and asylum seekers are the two groups I'll be talking about today, which are people who fit or more or less or fit the definition that I just described, people who have had to flee war, violence, or conflict or persecution, and have crossed an international border. Although I also do reporting on people who have had to flee those things but remain in their country. We call them IDPs, internally displaced people, often rather than refugees, but I'll also be talking about some of those today. Also, to give some, context about, what are we talking about, is I think there's been a bit in the news the recent years about Title 42. Title 42 is a piece of U.S. legislation that dates back to 1944, actually, that allows federal authorities to prohibit people from entering the United States if they could be a health risk. And that was invoked by the last presidential administration during the start of the coronavirus outbreak. And there's actually a lot of news which we can maybe get into that's today about the end of the enforcement of or the use of Title 42. But just to be clear, I think we're going to talk hopefully a little bit today about international law and U.S. law related to refugees. And again, and as far as refugees, there are 5 recognized currently protected groups, grounds for being admitted or for as an asylee, which is race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. Just to give you a sense of refugees in the world today. I think one situation that we think about these days is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all of the Ukrainians who are fleeing. And I have journalist colleagues and friends who are reporting on this now. In Ukraine, I believe, as best estimates we have, 14,000 civilians have been killed since that conflict began. And I think, I forget how many in the low millions are believed to have fled now. But just for perspective, the war in a country above the country where I am based in Kenya, in Ethiopia, there's a war that's been going on for 2 years, where an estimated 600,000 people have been killed and civilians have been killed, in contrast to the 14,000 killed in Ukraine, as far as we know. And I just bring that up to give the example that often when we think about refugees, I think the first thing we think about is the refugees who are most recently in the news, maybe because of a climate disaster, maybe because of a war. But I think often we forget that at any given moment, the one that's most in the news is not necessarily the one where the most people are being forced to flee, that it's producing the most refugees. And so I just hope maybe later we'll get a little bit more time to talk about some of those other locations where refugees are fleeing currently, and some of the nations that are doing the most to house refugees currently, which is in the United States is not among those. Anyways, that's what I hope we take away from this. So let me get into it. I'm a journalist. I graduated from UW-Madison here in journalism and Latin American studies, and have been working abroad as an international journalist ever since. I'm a freelance journalist, which means I don't work for just one publication. I come up with story ideas, develop them, find sources, and eventually propose those stories to magazines and newspapers in the US and the UK. And if one of them agrees, then I go out and I write the story. So I started reporting actually on immigration, first with Mexican immigrants in Wisconsin. Working here at Wisconsin Watch, the investigative journalism center here, based out of the journalism school at UW, I would spend time going to dairy farms to meet communities in rural Wisconsin that were being transformed by Mexican immigrants, some of whom were also asylum seekers because they'd not wanted to simply immigrate, but were actually fleeing violence or whatnot in Mexico or at that time. After college, I moved down to the Dominican Republic and Haiti, where I'd studied abroad down there. And I moved to Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, which resulted in Haiti has a population at that time of about 10 million people, and more than 1.5 million had been displaced by that single disaster, the earthquake in 2010. Most of them still remaining within Haiti, almost all of them. And so did a lot of reporting on those people. Also on stateless people in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic in 2013, the Supreme Court illegally stripped the nationality of tens of thousands of people who had been born in the Dominican Republic, but were of Haitian ancestry, and took away their citizenship. So as we speak, that hasn't been remedied, and there are tens of thousands of people who are stateless stuck on this island in the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and many of them have never been to Haiti, don't speak Creole, and they're stuck in the Dominican Republic without citizenship. Eventually, I went to grad school and shifted my focus from Latin America to Africa, and that's what brought me to Kenya, where I started meeting LGBTQ refugees. First, these were people who were fleeing Uganda. So neighboring Uganda, I guess I'll introduce it this way. I started meeting people who were refugees who were telling me how they were fleeing their own families back in Uganda, families that wanted to disown them and didn't want to be associated with having a child who was queer. And they were telling me about kind of the stories they faced there. So I also met activists who had fled Uganda at that time to Kenya because and had to flee because of their activism. And they told me about terrible things, not just in their home countries of Uganda and the other countries they came from, but in Kenya. Many were being evicted by their landlords when their landlords found out they were queer. Many were blackmailed by police officers in Kenya who would find out that they were there illegally, as they have sort of a double shadow life there, because one, they're illegal as refugees, who aren't in a refugee camp in the proper process. They were living in Nairobi, the ones I first met. And two, their identity is illegal in a way, because acts of homosexuality are still illegal in Kenya and are still illegal in 32 African countries, most of them based on laws that the British introduced. And as the British colonized large parts of the world, I think there are 36 countries in the world that still have British era laws still in the books against homosexuality, and Kenya is one of those. Uganda is also one of those. And so I started hearing about meeting these people in Nairobi who I was introduced to, who had been through these terrible experiences. And I got curious of what forced them to flee. Where does it all come from? And so I ended up going back to Uganda to meet people there. And I met with religious leaders and all sorts of activists and LGBT people there. Maybe the best way to introduce it is kind of following along with the format of the book, which some of you may have the chance to see. Basically, to step back for a minute, at the time I was working with photographer Jake Naughton, also an alum of the school, who had spent time in Kenya and also speaks some Swahili. And basically, we ended up just doing story after story about the plight of these people, because these were people who are not fleeing war. They're not refugees fleeing war or conflict. They're people fleeing countries that are at peace. Uganda was at peace. Ethiopia at that time, the other countries people were fleeing, were all peaceful. So these are people fleeing as refugees, but not fleeing conflict. And we thought that was really fascinating. And we started pitching these stories or publishing these stories about people in a few different cities. So basically, we pitched a lot. We ended up publishing 15 different magazine stories, magazine or newspaper or web stories about LGBT refugees in East Africa. And eventually we compiled all of that into the book, which I think you now have a link to at the very least. And the book is divided into 4 sections, and I'll kind of introduce a story of each of these people through those 4 sections. One is in, I think we'll go in order. The first section is Kampala. And so it's a photography book primarily with Jake Naughton's photos, but I introduce each section. And so it's the Kampala reporting that we did. Kampala is the capital of Uganda. It's a place where many people were fleeing from. And so the book gets into it a little bit, but some of the articles that I did get into it even a little bit more about what sparked this kind of mass migration of LGBT refugees from Uganda in the first place. So what happened in Uganda? As I mentioned, there was already a law when you got against acts. But what happened was actually after during some of these US culture wars here at home, there was a referendum in California, that banning same-sex marriage. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear and effectively rejected that ban by refusing to hear that in 2013. And it was at that time that, and even a little before that time actually, that a Christian evangelical pastor named Scott Lively from California began traveling to Uganda, he and some others as well, speaking with Ugandan parliament, kind of taking this culture war that evangelical conservatives were losing sort of politically in California and in parts of the US, taking that abroad. And so these evangelical leaders started to travel to Uganda, in particular, where there were mission work they were doing already, and started advocating for Uganda to do more against LGBT people there, despite that there were already laws with imprisonment for LGBT people. Eventually, some of these Ugandan legislators created a law and introduced a law that would have the death penalty for people convicted of homosexual acts. And so that law was eventually amended to life imprisonment for people convicted of homosexual acts, and it was passed in that form. And so there was this frenzy where suddenly if you were in Uganda and you were found to be LGBTQ, even on suspicion of committing, of having sex, even on suspicion, you could be jailed and imprisoned and potentially imprisoned for life. And so that was passed in 2013, signed into law by Uganda's longstanding autocrat in 2014. And it was only later that it was struck down by a court in Uganda, but not just on a technicality. There wasn't a quorum at the time that it was passed, but not because anyone wanted to reverse the effect of that law. But the fervor surrounding that law was real. I mean, media in Uganda published headlines. It wasn't just politicians. I mean, the media, news media published headlines like "Hang them" with pictures of accused homosexuals with the title "Hang them," kill them over it. And really, media were also involved in making putting people's lives in danger. And in fact, one prominent LGBT activist in Uganda, David Kato, was murdered at that time. And so LGBT Ugandans, those who had the means, many of them fled, and many of them toward the border with Kenya, which if they were able to cross, they made their way either to the refugee camps in northern Kenya, which have refugees. This particular one had a lot of refugees from Sudan, from past civil war in Sudan, and then others went to Nairobi, where I was living as a journalist. And So I want to get, and each of those places became scenes, sections of the book, which I'll get into. Before I get into that, I do want to say, speaking, there was a Ugandan group, Sexual Minorities Uganda, that actually sued Scott Lively, one of these evangelical pastors, in a Massachusetts federal court for violating the Alien Tort Statute. It's something that allows victims of human rights abuses to sue in U.S. courts. And the judge eventually found that Scott Lively had aided and abetted a vicious and frightening campaign of repression against LGBTI persons, working with his counterparts in Uganda to, quote, deprive them of the protection of the law and render their very existence illegal. It was a clear violation of their human rights. The judge said that Lively's crackpot bigotry could be brushed aside as pathetic, except for the terrible harm it can cause, end quote. And ultimately, because all of that happened in Uganda, the judge had to ruled that the U.S. had no jurisdiction over the case. So Scott Lively was not in the end convicted because it wasn't viewed that it had jurisdiction there. But anyways, now I wanted to give you the end of that legal case. But let's talk about Nairobi and Kakuma. So I mentioned so Nairobi, where I live, I was meeting mostly people in safe houses. So these are people who were living in, well, they weren't that safe, but they would get raided by police from time to time. But a bunch of LGBT Ugandans would be living together in an apartment that one of them maybe had found. And they were hiding from the police, hoping to submit their paperwork to be entered into the resettlement process, which we'll talk about. But again, I talked about there how those people were facing blackmail. Refugees aren't allowed to be outside of refugee camps in Kenya. So I talked a little bit about that, and that's one section of the book. You'll see a lot of photography from inside that safe house, or one of the safe houses in Nairobi. But another section of the book you'll see takes place in the refugee camp in Kakuma, refugee camp in northern Kenya. And so when I first went to Kakuma to try to meet some of the LGBT refugees there, it's really struck me that you get a sense of how permanent this place is. Refugees, I think the way we used to think of them as people who are temporarily in flux, fleeing and hopefully eventually either going home, or if that's not possible because a war isn't ending or something, eventually being resettled elsewhere. But the refugee camps in Kenya, at least, aren't like that. I mean, there are generations of people. There are people who are grandparents in Kakuma refugee camp whose kids and grandkids have been born in that camp and may forever live in that camp because they can't return to Sudan or they can't return to Somalia. And so you get a real sense of the permanence of these places and the permanence of this situation. And that permanence is a result of the fact that people can't return to their homelands because it's not safe. There's still conflict there, but B, because not many nations are taking not that many people in resettling them through that resettlement process. And so in Kakuma refugee camp, as you'll see in the book, we met people who, Ugandans and people from all sorts of different countries who were LGBTQ, who, might never feel safe returning, or certainly now did not feel safe returning to their homeland because homophobia is so rife there, and they had been maybe attacked, chased away by their own families. Some of them had been raped and corrective rape kind of traumatic experiences with people trying to turn them straight. Terrible things we discovered when we were meeting these people in the refugee camp up there. But unfortunately, many of them, just as the nature of the number of people who win that ticket to resettlement, many of them remain there to this day. And so one of our stories for Vice magazine focused on the resettlement system. So the UNHCR, which is the UN agency responsible for refugees, they have a system by which every year any country in the world that wants to accept refugees by way of resettlement, they tell the UNHCR, okay, we'll take this many people, and they kind of secretly tell, we want people, we don't want Somalis, we don't want these sorts of people who could be terrorist threats. Behind closed doors, they kind of talk about what sort of people they want. And the UN managed to find a couple countries that were willing to expedite the cases of LGBT refugees, because you get to the camp and you see that these people had a really serious problem. Even in this refugee camp, they were sometimes being attacked by other refugees, or they were being, when they would stand in line for food. On a couple occasions, their their huts were burned, their houses were burned down because by other refugees. And so what did the UN do? The UN decided, okay, let's put these people on a fast track for resettlement. But the problem with that is that, as we wrote for Vice, was that once that word got out about that, it angered other refugees in the camps who also face violence, some of them as women, some of them as being from ethnic groups that are persecuted in their home countries and continue to be persecuted in that camp. People were angry. And then also Ugandans back in Uganda heard about this, and it became a pull factor. People said, oh, wow, I can go to Kenya and live in a refugee camp for only 6 months, and then I can be resettled to the United States or Canada, and seeing photos of some people who were finally resettled to other countries. So we created this pull factor, and on one particular day, 200 people arrived claiming asylum on the basis of being LGBT Ugandans. They arrived to this camp in Kenya, and the UN realized we have not only created a pull factor, we actually have created an incentive for imposters. And a lot of these people probably were not LGBTQ people when they were trying to get resettled through that system. Just to give you a sense of how complicated it can be. But really, most of this complication comes from the fact that rich nations such as our own don't accept many people, many refugees through this program. So at its height, I believe the United States has only ever taken as many as 125,000 refugees resettled in a year, and it's very most, I think. And during the Trump administration, I think that number got reduced to as low as 14,000 some years. Trump made it a very big point to try to exclude the resettlement of refugees or to try to wind that program down. And it has not yet gone up very high under the current administration. So just to give you a sense of, for perspective, in Germany, where I've recently spent some time reporting on refugees and a year in 2016, actually, 500,000 seekers, and eventually 900,000 of those people in that 1 year eventually were granted, at least temporarily, in Germany. Compare that, Germany, a much smaller country than the United States, compared to the US, that was only taking as little as 14,000 people a year. You just get a sense of there's a lot of variance among what rich nations are willing to do when it comes to resettling refugees. Other countries do far more. Uganda is actually one of the countries with the most refugees. I don't have the numbers here somewhere, but Uganda has tons of refugees from South Sudan and from other places. Kenya hosts a ton. Jordan, Turkey host refugees from Syria. I think Turkey has more than 3 million refugees currently. And so compared to the United States, a country that's much more wealthy, much larger, and could certainly accommodate far more people, we don't do nearly as much as countries like Turkey or Uganda or Jordan or even Germany are doing to help resettle these refugees. So that's a little bit of a vision of what was going on in Kakuma refugee camp. I talked a little bit about Nairobi, but after all this Kenya reporting, reporting on the LGBT refugees who had come to Kenya to try to go through this resettlement process and be resettled, we wanted to go back to Uganda to sort of look at what things were like there for people who had remained. Because if things were so bad that many of these people had to flee for their lives to Kenya, we wanted to see, well, how are the ones who haven't fled faring there? And so we went first to Kampala, and there we met with, there's a robust group of LGBT activists in Kampala, some of whom they talked us through a lot of the initial struggles for gay rights there, which are not the same issues as gay marriage or things that became discussed and eventually passed here in the United States. But speaking with some of the, it was really interesting actually, kind of turning some of these assumptions that I had, turning them on their head when I went to Uganda. The battle at first wasn't, equal rights for LGBTQ people. It was what is homosexuality? I mean, it's something that, wasn't talked about, and many Ugandans believe didn't exist there. It wasn't really until the American evangelicals started coming over and preaching against it that people became to know what homosexuality was. And so actually it was in order to sort of point out defend human rights, a lot of these activists in Uganda first had to do education campaigns to show people what is homosexuality, what does that mean, and who are we. They started having gay pride parades, as well as doing all sorts of sort of educational activities just to help people understand, what that even is, because it wasn't something that was publicly talked about. And so, but that visibility, as they became more visible, both because they wanted to be more visible and because they were being criticized by evangelical groups and other Christian groups in Uganda, it of course became a danger to people, a double-edged sword. There was a lot of violence against these people that caused many to flee. So what I did when I was in Kampala, we visited a safe house. Well, again, an unsafe house, maybe might be a better way to put it, it was like a few rooms in a basement that more than a dozen or 15 Ugandans were living in because they had been maybe outed at work by their bosses and then fired. And then maybe the people had informed the police that they were gay and police had hunted them down, some of them. These people were just living, unable to leave most of the time in this basement without fear of being recognized on the street and maybe chased down and arrested by police. I also met a transgender refugee, not a refugee yet at that time, a transgender woman named Javan, who I wrote about in a long piece for actually Playboy magazine. Ended up taking this piece about this transgender refugee who became a refugee, and she fled to Kenya after facing some really horrible threats from within her own family. And then, but she was interesting because she eventually decided to return from Kenya when she wasn't able to be resettled. She returned from Kenya to Kampala. And it was an interesting scene, Kampala, just 5 years after this law was passed and then overturned. Things had quieted down to the extent that, at least in certain spaces, people could be visible. And so we went to like a gay bar where she felt really comfortable being out and dancing. And it's kind of this weird double life where people with the right connections or the right resources or enough money to go to a bar in the city could kind of be out in a certain scene, still face threats and violence sometimes. She was attacked by people on the street once for the way she was dressing, but had a safe space, this bar in her case, where she felt like this was her community, and she had these communities she wanted to go back, and actually went back after she had been a refugee in Kenya, went back to Uganda. And we saw this kind of urban, dilemma of a lot of these activists were proud of the fact that they didn't leave Uganda, or really trying to persuade people not to flee and say, we need you here. We need you here. We need you to be visible and show people that we are productive members of society, or that we are humans who have human rights here in Uganda. And so a lot of those activists, there was kind of a split in the messaging on that. One of the things that came up that a lot of activists complained about to me was that when President Barack Obama visited Uganda, I think it was 2014, he did bring up the issue in a speech about just briefly about gay rights, and that created a huge backlash. And activists had hoped that he wouldn't do that because there's a lot of nationalism in Uganda, as in the United States, of course, and Ugandans, just like Americans, didn't want someone from some other country telling them what to do. And there was this kind of backlash then again of homophobic backlash against people because of Barack Obama's statements. It brought everything back to the news, and people said, oh, we don't have homosexuals here. If so, we need to get them out. We need to route them. They should go to America, go somewhere else. And it was kind of this other backlash. So again, I think it comes from this this need for all of us, both journalists and as policymakers, to think about the way we're approaching issues. I was listening to a podcast today about the World Cup in Qatar, and how one journalist who's covered the corruption and the human rights situation in Qatar for the last 4 or 5 years has been saying that some fans come planning to wave LGBTQ flags and kind of homosexuality is illegal in Qatar and kind of be visible. And he said he's worried that this is going to cause the government to kind of backlash and repress the local population and crack down on their line is we don't have homosexuals in Qatar, and so they want to make sure that they don't, and that might repress people even further at home. So it's just kind of the biggest warning I would take take away from, at least or my reporting, was the way that we as advocates approach this sort of thing. I mean, we might have the privilege of, in the United States, some groups wanting to be out and be visible, but sometimes that's not the right thing. These activists tell me that's not the right approach that they want to have in places like Uganda or in places like Kenya. And talking about, there's also a lot of things that we take for assumptions. For example, just reporting and meeting all of these LGBTQ people in East Africa, pronouns. I would be speaking with people mostly in English. A lot of these were educated people when were in college or university when they got chased out of their dorms and then they had to flee and their countries. People go back and forth on their pronouns. It was actually a little newer to me when I came back to the United States on visits, and people were very, it's very important now to recognize pronouns, but and then identify those identifiers. But in Kenya and in Uganda, especially with transgender people, their friends would sometimes be referring to Javan, for example, as she or her, and other times in the same conversation as he or him. And interestingly, that wasn't an issue that most people I met wanted to. It's not how they identify. They didn't identify at all. Especially transgender people we met as needed. They didn't care what pronouns were used, and to them there were other issues that mattered more to them. Like, for example, families. Just kind of being accepted by their family was the thing that people kept coming back to because the family ties were so strong. That if you're disowned or by your family in Uganda, that cuts off your chances of getting a job. That cuts off your chances of having crowdfunding to help you go to university. It's really everything, and your family. Those ties are really strong. So a lot of people had different issues, not gay marriage or whatever that at this time they were concerned with, and so that was something that I had to try to translate through these articles I was writing to convey. These are the issues that really matter to people then. But anyways, we've talked about, so I was just talking about Kampala. That's a sense of the Ugandan capital city and how this kind of double life of, there are space activists, communities there, even despite everything that we talked about. Nairobi, same situation in Nairobi, although Nairobi, you have a big separation between Kenyans and then these refugees from other countries who are LGBTQ, who are kind of holed up in these safe houses, hoping to maybe be resettled, although it's unlikely for most of them. And we talked about Kakuma refugee camp in northern Kenya, which is really desolate. I mean, in Kakuma camp, you get food rations, some, but you're not technically allowed to leave the camp, and you're there with I forget how many people live in Kakuma. I think it's like more than 600,000 refugees there, many of whom will never be resettled. The last place, so that those are 3 of the 4 sections of the book. The final section of the book takes place in a rural part of Uganda, where we were expecting that it would be really hard for people in rural areas to be out. Communities are small. It's if you're outed or criticized or attacked for being homosexual, you don't have anywhere else to go. If you're in a small town and everyone knows each other, you have nowhere to hide. You don't have a safe house or something like that. But we were so surprised when we went to the town of Mbale in eastern Uganda and discovered that actually people were far more out there than they had been in Kampala, in the capital, in the bigger city. And so we have a section of the book that tells the story of some of the people and how they managed to be out to their families and to their friends in that region in Mbale. And we invite you to definitely read their stories. I think there's also, you may be able to find their stories also in Huck magazine. We published some stories from Mbale and also in the Christian Science Monitor. So if you Google those, or if you look up those news outlets, we have stories from Mbale there. But we met people, met people who have 2 different lives on social media. So people who have a Facebook account that's their straight account, and that's also their queer account, as one person explained to me and showed me that to their family, they have, everyone's on social media. These are young people for the most part we were speaking with. And, they would show that, unfortunately, I guess, unfortunately, they have these, Facebook, Instagram profiles that they show to their families and totally different ones they show to their friends, but they can kind of merge between those 2 lives. And, on a daily basis, they're with their families and they are who they are. And maybe the families don't question. In some cases, the families were even supportive. There was a someone who was transgender, whose father, his work took him all around the world, and he had been exposed to LGBT rights and these notions. And so when he just when his daughter started to say, I think I feel I want to identify as a woman. He understood that actually, and that family did in this rural part of Uganda. So we thought that was kind of fascinating. So you can read some of these stories in those publications, and again, you'll see they're mentioned and photographed in this book. I think with just a couple minutes left before I open it to questions, I do want to say that in the book, you'll notice that many people, many of the names are actually pseudonyms, which I think we have mentioned in the introduction. And many of the photos, a lot of people who you'll see a portrait of them identifying their face, oftentimes those are people who have been resettled to the United States or Canada or Europe or somewhere safer, although not always safe. Some people have still been attacked here in the United States after being resettled. But a lot of the people who you see photographed in a way that doesn't identify them, it's because at that time of the book publishing, they were still in Kenya or Uganda or somewhere where they weren't safe. And so a lot of what we did throughout this process was speaking with people about what they're comfortable with and whatnot in terms of their safety and trying to make sure that they stay safe and that our reporting doesn't put them in jeopardy. So to wrap up, I kind of wanted to talk about LGBTQ refugees in East Africa as a way of getting at this idea about, refugees in general and these issues of, the State Department of the US has a plan for 2022 to try to resettle 125,000 people this year. That was their plan, as opposed to, I realized it was 12,500 is the small number of people who are actually resettled, not just gay refugees, but refugees resettled to the United States last year. Asylum, when it comes to asylum seekers, and that, such as people coming to the Mexico border from Central America, these cases are decided by judges, and only about 1/3 of these cases in normal times in the US, 1/3 of these people eventually receive asylum coming to the United States directly through a border, and only 1/4 did during a few years of the Trump administration. It just kind of stands out as the US isn't necessarily, in many people's opinions, living up to its actual obligations under international law. And again, to grant asylum to those who qualify for it. Because again, I think one of the main things that I hope students who I speak to about this come away with is that there are laws. And so the US is party to the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights and then the 1951 refugee convention that requires nations to admit people who are, have fled war, violence, or conflict or persecution and have crossed international borders to find safety. So I think it's really important to remember that these aren't just, it's not only ethics, it's laws. And of course, there are a lot of even lawsuits still pending against here in the United States over the last administration's potential violation of some of those obligations as well. So with that, I know I definitely want to open it up to questions. I unfortunately didn't get through everything I wanted to. We didn't have enough time, but yeah, I'd like to open it up to questions that you have for me about this or really about even anything else that you'd like. So yeah, we'll open it up, and maybe if there's been questions posed in the chat, maybe someone can call on those people so they can raise them to me directly.
Thank you very much, Jacob. So for all of our guests today, if you want to raise your virtual hand, you can do that using the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you're welcome to type questions into the chat. Essie and I will both keep an eye on that and help facilitate that. So feel free if there are some, as sometimes we're shy like our students. So I do have a couple of questions that we can kind of start with to get the ball rolling if that helps. But you started, Jacob, by talking about challenging a really strong, almost existential narrative that exists in the US, this idea that we are a global melting pot and have been a haven for immigrants and refugees for a very long time. So what would you recommend, or how would you, conceptualize helping educators teach the unlearning of such a strong narrative that's been a part of, there's quite a few high school teachers that are, here this evening. So thinking about, as students start to conceptualize what it means to be an American, or what role the United States has played in that, the unlearning of that narrative.
Definitely. I mean, I think there's a lot of great, I mean, again, I'm biased because I'm a journalist. Thanks for that question. I'm biased because I'm a journalist, but I think there's a lot of good journalism out there that has, especially recently, investigated examples of times when we've, interned Japanese immigrants and Americans born to Japanese immigrants during World War II. I mean, there's been moments where mainstream press and conversation has really brought some of these subjects to life. So I guess I might suggest finding examples like that sort of complicate this narrative of the U.S. as a welcoming nation to immigrants, whether it's the I think the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, looking at how far back we were excluding immigrants, to think about I guess turning that assumption on its head, that the U.S. is a country that accepts immigrants, and pointing out that the vast majority of asylum seekers, in terms of refugee people seeking asylum, are not admitted, and the vast majority of people who want to immigrate to the U.S. Are unable to, from all over the world. So, CSIS. I mean, there's a whole lot of. I mean, there was plenty of information out there and research, or statistics that you can use to introduce in your classroom. But I think maybe the most official thing is to, if you're in a district that has, a lot of a high Mexican population of Mexican students, or students who are the children of Mexican immigrants, as I have a friend who is in Milwaukee, who I think he does a very good job about talking about, bringing students, if people want to talk about that in the classroom, asking people, what is your experience, what are your parents' experiences like, getting here and remaining here in the United States. I mean, I spent time on dairy farms that were, run by Mexican immigrants on Wisconsin dairy farms, who, told me about the sort of plights coming here. So, if you have that natural connection based on the students you have in the class, that's maybe one way to do it. I don't know about, obviously you don't want to single students out and make anyone uncomfortable. But I think the other best way is to just take an example that maybe you have a session or class where you learn about internally in Japan, or deportation of Haitians, even after this natural disaster, and that the U.S. response was not to accept Haitians after the 2010 earthquake, but to get rid of more Haitian immigrants and send more of them back. I mean, it's kind of endless, the number of examples that are there. I wish I had a better answer for which ones to point you to, but those are a few that come to mind. Obviously, more recently with Afghanistan, and how as the U.S. military was pulling out of Afghanistan, you had all of these translators, people who had put their lives on the line to work for and help keep safe, U.S. soldiers, protect their lives, that their lives suddenly were now in danger and they were unable to get out of Afghanistan. So I think looking at that as kind of a more recent example of the U.S. Refusing not just any other immigrants, but people who had risked their lives to save American lives. Now we are putting their lives at risk by pulling out and not taking them with us. I think that's something that you've seen a lot of journalism about lately, that maybe could be a good example of that in more recent times. So yeah, those are just a few examples that come to mind. Oh, I think you're muted, Molly.
I like that Zoom yells at you now. It tells you you're trying to talk and you're muted. Thank you. So Essie posted in the chat and asked if you could speak a little bit more about the court case where the evangelical preacher was prosecuted in the United States, but that didn't fully end up with what I guess we in the US would consider to be justice, in the sense of prison, or I guess some kind of punishment in that sense. So just wanting to hear the details again and understand why the case was dismissed.
Definitely. So this one piece was quite a while ago. So, but I have the judge's name here. Let me see if I can find the case name. I mean, it must have been someone versus the Lively. But if you Google U.S. District Court judge here, let me just paste it in case people want to find it. What I'm kind of if you really want to read about the case, then what you need to do is, what you could do is read my article for Playboy magazine. But I don't know how many of you are at school and have firewalls and don't know what kind of ads you're going to get reading that story. But to its credit, this is a magazine that accepted right away this story that Jake, the photographer, and I wanted to write about transgender, Javan in particular is transgender Ugandan, and also about the plight of LGBT people in Kampala specifically. And that's the article in which we actually got into the legalities of this case against Scott Lively and into all of that. So I'll post a link here, open at your own risk, because I don't know what kind of advertising they do now, but yeah, that's to its credit, a magazine that when let us get into the details of that legal case. I was able to get a response from the judge who had retired, luckily, so he was able to speak with me. And so that's all. If you want to read more, I would read that article, maybe with an ad blocker.
Thank you. Jeffrey has a question. What does the country do if they've admitted more refugees than they can support? And do we see generational refugee camps throughout the world?
Great question. It's so interesting because that's a big argument you hear in so many countries against accepting refugees. Certainly you heard it in Germany, 2015, 2016. We can't sustain this. This isn't, it's not possible. I have yet to be in any country, even the Dominican Republic, even Turkey, anywhere where that turned out to be the case. Certainly not in the United States, rich nations that have, so much capacity, and not even in Germany, which took in, in a short time span, far more, asylum seekers as the US has. So I haven't really encountered a situation where that turned out to be the case, where nations were overwhelmed. Certainly, like in Germany, people will point out that, there's maybe housing shortages, or there's definitely effects when you have a lot of people coming in. But if you look at the immigration research centers and immigration policy center, CSIS, these different ones in the think tanks in the US that do research on this, you find that it's not really measurable, the economic impact, except for, I think almost all economists in the United States agree that the United States, as Germany and as many other rich countries, need more labor, and they need immigrant labor. Immigrant labor is the easiest solution to the lack of workforces that we're facing here and in Germany and those sorts of places. So yeah, I guess I haven't really encountered a situation where nations were overwhelmed. I mean, Germany, at first, there were huge queues of people outside the asylum, the centers where you'd have to do the paperwork and apply for asylum. So yeah, there were times where people unfortunately had to sleep out on the street and that sort of thing. But I don't know if nations as a whole were overwhelmed by any of these rich nations. At least that's not speaking of nations bordering Syria or whatnot, that really those Jordan, Uganda, these are countries that don't have as many resources. Uganda, to its credit, is an example of a lot of countries like Kenya require refugees to be in the refugee camps, and you can't really find jobs there. You can't really advance yourself. You're just stuck. In Uganda, those refugee camps, though, they actually have a program where they give refugees from South Sudan land that they can farm and allow them to work. If they can find work elsewhere, they're allowed to actually leave and go do those jobs, which economists tend to agree with as being a much smarter solution. And whereas it depends on every country, but in Kenya, as a refugee, you really can't get a work permit to actually hold a job to become independent. So much less leave the camp without a written permission. So I got a little off topic, but just to that bigger question of being overwhelmed, I think that's an important issue to discuss with students of if students are hearing concerns and know people who are concerned about being overwhelmed by refugees, see if you can find any examples of that actually happening, and or not really, because I certainly haven't really encountered it, but yeah.
And then there was a second part of his question about seeing generational refugee camps in other places or around the world.
Definitely, thanks for that. Yes, so that's the other thing about I mentioned the permanence in Kakuma camp and just seeing these generations of people who have lived there and will continue to live there for generations. But that's kind of true in other places. I haven't worked all over the world, but I know in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the island in the Caribbean, Hispaniola, where I used to report, there are, there are IDP, well, basically there were refugee people who became displaced by the earthquake in Haiti who remain in these, in one particular city that's not really a recognized city in Haiti that I've written about for a magazine called VQR, the Virginia Quarterly Review. There's a big story there about how people were displaced by this earthquake in Haiti, ended up moving to this vacant land, and now are self-governing and are trying to keep government out of that land, and trying to make it a permanent home for themselves in this new place, but without any interference from their government, kind of not ungoverned, but governed among themselves. And actually, in this town called Canaan, the city in Haiti, but also in the Dominican Republic, you have bates, which are old sugarcane plantations for the most part, where the Dominican Republic used to bring in a lot of Haitian labor in order to work the sugarcane fields. And then these are communities where still you have a lot of people who are descendants of Haitians living in those places. And now, because many have been stripped of their Dominican citizenship, the children, the grandchildren have been illegally, according to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, been stripped of their Dominican nationality. They're stateless. So they're in the Dominican Republic. They cannot, I mean, they're not Haitian citizens. Technically, they can't get a visa to go to Haiti without having a passport, which they don't have anymore. So they're stuck, in theory, in the Dominican Republic. Many, don't even speak Creole, couldn't go to Haiti, or wouldn't know what to do there. And they're no longer Dominicans either. So you have this kind of now permanent population. And in this case, these people are stuck on an island. There's not really even great migration routes for people to try to, it's very difficult for people to leave the Dominican Republic or Haiti and try to immigrate elsewhere because it's an island as well.
We have time for maybe one more question as we come up on 5 o'clock here. So from Stephanie, for countries that respond so negatively to advocates, such as your Qatar example, what is the hope for those advocates or those who are being oppressed in those places?
That's a great question. And that's exactly why we as journalists need to do a better job of asking those advocates. So often when we see LGBTQ reporting, for example, I think, you see quotes from human rights activists in the US talking about the situation in Uganda or in Qatar or wherever. And, you speak with, if you actually go on the ground and meet these people, they are wishing people sometimes would stop saying these certain things. They wish Obama would have spoken in private to the Ugandan autocrat leader, and pushed him in private, but not said anything publicly that could have spiraled out of control when he made his visit there to Uganda. So I think that's and certain enough is kind of advocating to have that support. And so that's so important. So many of these groups, sadly, even some of the most well-known groups and human rights groups don't, or especially the charities and the NGOs, I think, don't always do a good job of pushing for the types of rights or the methods of obtaining rights that the locals want. Instead, they'll just do what they're familiar with and push for things, whether it's gay marriage or equality, or they'll be very vocal about it, which sometimes that visibility, as we discussed, can be bad. So I'm glad you're asking the question. I hope it's something that we think about on any issue, in addition to just LGBT rights, any issue at all, in these other countries. We need to not assume what it is that people want and how things need to be solved, but rather we need to be asking people in those places what sort of support they want and the path forward. So, for example, just briefly, I know we're out of time. I've covered for the Atlantic and New Yorker and some other places this case of activists in Kenya who are fighting to repeal the British law, the British era law in Kenya against homosexuality. And it came before Kenya's second highest court a few years ago, and I wrote some articles about it. Because many activists in these former colonies, all over Africa, there were former European colonies, they said, first of all, there was no such thing as homophobia, or certainly there weren't laws against homophobia until the British and these other colonizers introduced it. And those laws are still on the books. So they're saying the first step is to repeal these laws and also to make people aware that this wasn't a thing. We didn't have laws against homosexuality before we were colonized, and these laws were imposed upon us, and now they still exist. So again, that's something that I learned was the strategy for these activists in Kenya and many other African countries is repealing those old laws that even though they aren't enforced, really, they're used to blackmail people. Police will threaten to arrest someone under those laws. No one uses them; they're not actually prosecuted. But that's kind of the strategy that activists in Kenya are taking currently, for example. So.
Well, thank you for your responses. Thank you also to everyone who joined us this evening and asked questions in the chat, and just wanted to amplify some gratitude from some of our guests tonight for taking the time to share your stories. I'm going to link to your website here in the chat, but if anyone wants to kind of keep in touch with what you're writing or follow, publications of yours that are upcoming, what's the best way for them to do that?
Definitely. Thanks so much. You can see all of the articles I've written on my website, which is just my name. I think there's been links to it. Also, if you go to the About page at the bottom, you can sign up for emails. And when I publish a new story, you'll get an email about that. Right now, I'm writing a book on an unrelated subject, so you probably won't be getting many emails for a long time. But eventually, as I continue to publish articles and that book, you'll get an email about it. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, but not that often.
Well, thank you very much. And so yeah, a lot of thanks in the chat for you. And then, so I think that brings to conclusion tonight's event. Thank you all educators for showing up. A reminder that this has been a recorded